Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this edition of MedTalks. Today's topic is very timely, navigating reintegration. This virtual broadcast is brought to you by the Sechelt Hospital Foundation and our friends at the Sunshine Coast Credit Union, who always step up when we need them. Technical services by Vasari Media Group. My name is Joanna Piras, and I am the host for this series of conversations, which we hope will help to cultivate our collective resilience now and on into the future. So happy day, right? The hairdressers are reopening, the pubs, your favorite restaurants are reopening, kids are being welcomed back into school, you might be able to go to the gym. So why aren't we all like deliriously happy? There's something else obviously going on. Today we want to talk about what might be going on in our hearts and our minds, and maybe giving us some helpful insights and some tips on how best to navigate that. We're fortunate to have our amazing panelists with us once again. They'll be taking your questions gladly. Please use the chat feature if you want to ask a question live, and we have received some questions in advance, so feel free to email us as well. Let me introduce our panel. First of all, Dr. Ral Gupta works as an integrative medical physician, professional coach, and mindfulness instructor. Dr. Lisa Kitt is a registered psychologist who specializes in traumatic stress and related mental health injuries. And Dr. Marius Velgemood is a consultant psychiatrist with Vancouver Coastal Health. He is the psychiatry lead for the Sunshine Coast and also lectures at the University of British Columbia. Ral, can I come to you first? All of these great things that are happening, things are relaxing, and yet there seems to be, I'm sure you've noticed, more anxiety than when we were tied up. Is it like isolation has become insulation, and now we're not sure that we want to jump out of the nest, right? What's going on with that?
Thank you, Joanna, and good afternoon, Sunshine Coast. It is such a great question, and I thought I might just start by maybe reiterating where we are right now. In many ways, we were facing unprecedented kind of conditions. And with that, we saw some public health measures that were put in place really to protect our most vulnerable members of society and to keep our healthcare system from getting overwhelmed. And from that perspective, it's worked great as a province. I think we've done remarkably well as a province and in our community. And we have a lot of people, including all of our listeners and the entire community, really to appreciate for that. At the same time, we are recognizing that our efforts to limit transmission has had some serious costs. And just to name a few of those costs have been social, they've been physical, they've been financial, they've been psychological. And so now we're in an interesting time because of our hard work, we're actually in a place where evidence is showing us that we can start to relax some of our strategies to keep us well. And in fact, there's signs that doing that would actually keep the curve flattened. But all this is unprecedented. And so in a sense, our first efforts were an experiment, and now we're in another experiment where together we're having to have this adaptive process where together we're trying to navigate this unknown territory. And so coming back to your question, Joanna, yes, there's actually new challenges that are here. And I think you're right, anxiety is probably top of the list. And what I'm hoping between myself and my colleagues, we might together just start to explore some of the different challenges we're facing. So I'm just going to name one and then hand it over to my colleagues. One I'm noticing around anxiety is, a lot of people that I've been talking to have been saying, I've just been getting used to this new normal. I finally am getting a bit of a routine. And now, once again, things are changing. It feels like, once again, the rug's being pulled from underneath my feet. And I don't even really feel like I'm clear about what my next steps might be in terms of keeping myself and my family safe. And that's a huge source of anxiety. Again, going back to some uncertainty and some unpredictability that actually we were just starting to recover from. So I'll maybe stop there and see if Lisa or Marius, either of you have something you'd like to share in terms of what you're seeing.
Uncertainty, exclamation mark, leading to frustration, anxiety, joy, and anger. It's we find ourselves in a time when we have that sense of optimism, but we're just not optimistic enough yet, which is not a bad thing. Cautious optimism is good at this stage. But we talk about being governed by regulations, yet wanting the freedom to make informed decisions. And navigating that space, that gray zone, is hard. And people are finding that to be quite a challenge. I find that to be quite a challenge. in the last few weeks, quite a few times, I had to ask myself, so if I had to look at public health guidelines and what it is that I want to be doing now, is that according to plan? Sometimes I couldn't quite find the plan. Sometimes the subjectivity of own responsibility comes into play. We start questioning that. We start doubting yourself. So I want to start off by saying, hey, I am right there with you with these confused emotions. That is alive and well. The question now is, how do we get through this? How do we navigate this space?
That's really well said, Marius. I was going to say something really similar. I love that we live in a society where we have a lot of personal autonomy and we get to make decisions, right? We don't want to live in a state that is really top down and heavy and tells us what to do and how to do it. And so this is interesting. I think in times of anxiety, people want black and white rule books around how to live. And yet that's not what we're going to get here. And I'm so glad. I don't want to live in a place like that, in a world, in a province or in a country like that. But with that comes this uncertainty. And the rules are going to continually change here, folks, because we don't really know how this is going to go. And so what do we do with that, right? Where is the uncertainty in that? How do we negotiate that? And I think there's a whole lot of personal responsibility that's needed to really have some self-awareness to know what's right for you. Maybe not what's right for somebody else, but we all have different circumstances here. Well, you're living with elderly parents, right? I've got kids in school and anxieties that come with that. Mars, you're at the hospital every single day. And so in and around more people all the time. And so we all have to look at our own situations and our own maybe underlying mental health needs, our own financial stresses, all of the assortment of factors that come into making decisions that are going to work for us. Mind you, keeping in mind the public health recommendations. I think I'll leave it there for now, but just reiterating the anxiety that people are noticing and feeling and wanting black and white, rule books. And yet that's not going to happen. And so here we are trying to negotiate and navigate this together collectively.
As you're speaking to that, Lisa, I was almost reflecting on the opposite, which is, along with anxiety, I'm seeing a lot more frustration and a lot more irritability. And for me, I know when I get to that stage, and I feel that within myself, and I've been feeling it more in the last few weeks, it has more to do with exhaustion. And I think we haven't really, coming with this time to relax some of our guard, also comes this sense of actually finally letting our system relax. And when we do that, what we find is all this accumulated tension. And so one of the big challenges is like, well, how do I actually even take care of myself? Because I don't feel quite myself right now. I'm still really frustrated and tired from just not necessarily having my own needs met or living in a world that's changing so rapidly. And then yet there's another change that I have to somehow navigate. And that's another tricky part of the time we find ourselves in.
And one of the other aspects of this is we are so afraid that we're going to undo the good work that's being done. Yet we have to realize that there's a time and a place for everything. And we have to adhere by what the guidelines are saying. And if the guidelines are saying, expand your bubble to a limited extent, do so cautiously, do so carefully, do so thoughtfully. We ought to do that. But we are so afraid that we've come so far. And what are we going to be doing now if we don't continue along this path? When I faced a few uncertain emotions, I asked myself, what is it really about? What are these emotions really about? And I think it came down to two things for me. One is I don't want to do no harm. I don't want to do anything that's going to lead to harm, that's going to hurt anyone, right? So that was one of my most prominent fears. And then my other fear was a bit of a selfish fear. And that was, what are people actually going to think of me if I start inviting people over and we have a nice barbecue? It's like, how is this going to be received? So one is a noble concern and an honorable concern, and one that I believe we'll all have. The other one was a little bit of a less honorable concern. But I think it's alive and well. I think people are struggling with that.
Mm-hmm. Especially with all the shaming that we're seeing in social media and in the world around people's behaviors, right? We want to avoid shame, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And so when we're fearful of shame, we stop and question our own natural inclinations. A couple other things that I'm noticing is in my clients and my patients mostly is a real need for connection. And it's showing up in a lot of different ways. But isolation, particularly for people who already have mental health challenges, is really difficult and impactful. And so I'm seeing people's mental health deteriorate more than before. And so as I think about risk, I'm trying to help folks understand risk as a whole person. And so not just risk of a virus that's real, but also risk of isolation for their mental health. And there might be financial risk. There's a lot of different risks that go into the equation that's going to decide or help people decide what's best for them. And so I've been having conversations with people about how to be safe and mitigate risk, but still get out in the world and find places where they can connect. Because it's so essential from a mental health perspective to engage in life again, to connect with yourself and to do things that cause and stimulate joy and love and play and just these essential life-giving activities and connections. And so I'm also seeing, connected to that, people who are really excited to get back into the world. I mean, I can put my hand up for that. There's things that I really miss that I want to re-engage in. And so to sort of quell my enthusiasm around some of those things and to try to figure out how to do those in a way that is socially responsible.
I really appreciate what you're bringing up, because the word that was coming up for me as you're sharing that was the word desperate. And some of us are feeling desperate around that need for connection. Yeah. And it could be desperate around even the need for getting some medical needs or haircutting needs or whatever it might be that we haven't been attending to. And there can be that sense of desperate need to just kind of have some familiar faces, familiar routines, familiar parts of our life return. And I think one of the challenges with that desperate quality to it is that it can become a little bit of an on or off switch. So we kind of forget that there might be some sort of middle ground here, but we just go right back to old ways of doing things. And that's a big challenge right now, because it may not be good for us or others if we don't bring some awareness to that.
I think that's a really good piece around. This is not binary, right? Our choices here are not binary. They're not completely isolated back to normal. I'm a big continuum person, as most of you all know by now. And so for me, that's all stuff in the middle here, decision-making that's gray, and that causes anxiety for people. But how beautiful at the same time as we get to choose. I think it's really important to get out of the black and white concrete thinking around this if we can, and see that there's some choice here that might work best for us.
Another interesting aspect of this is in life, certainly in my life, predictability and certainty is something that I yearn for. I like to know that I have things sorted out, figured out, whatever. Now, we find that as we see sometimes in a relationship that is not going well, in circumstances that are, filled with adversity, people get used to suffering. And there's an element of that predictability, even when the circumstances are less optimal. That is a false sense of safety. And then when you have to push yourself beyond that and you encounter yet again another space of uncertainty, it's almost like we want to go back to that place we've known, even though that place is maybe not the best of places. That sense of certainty brings about some comfort. So as we head into this next phase of this epidemic, we find ourselves with uncertainty again. And just as we're going to get comfortable with what we're seeing now, they're going to change the rules again, and we're going to see some uncertainty. And then depending on what the what the statistics are showing us and what the virus is doing, we might see even the things moving in the opposite direction again. So this is so it's so much filled with uncertainty, and I need to learn to tolerate that uncertainty. And I need to just shape up and improve in that regard. But I think that's another element to what we're seeing at the moment. People are struggling with that sense of uncertainty and would rather go back to a place of suffering that they've known and that feels somewhat secure.
Safer, right? I think this is actually a really interesting social experiment around anxiety, and to take a look at yourself to see how you tolerate uncertainty tells us a lot about potentially for some people underlying propensity towards anxiety. Some folks are fine right now and they kind of like the uncertainty. They're trying to negotiate and play with it, and it feels more lighthearted and playful, where other people experience a lot of anxiety in it. And that's not good or bad, it just is. But to notice that in ourselves and decide how to be with ourselves, hopefully compassionately in that space, is really important and hard.
So I wonder if we were to turn maybe to talk about some ideas about how to navigate some of these challenges that we're talking about. Would that be okay with you guys if we go there?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So maybe I'll just start us off with one that came to my mind as we're talking, because I'm noticing, along with that emotional exhaustion, I've been exhausted with trying to keep up with like protocols. I mean, the protocols keep changing, and I noticed some resistance within myself to look at them. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting many emails from a lot of different sources updating me around what I ought to be doing next. And so one thing that I'm finding useful is just to remind myself that see if I can find 2, 3, maybe 4 sources of information that I know are credible, that are likely to give me useful information. Because one of the ways we can manage uncertainty is to get informed. But we want to make sure the sources of information are ones that are useful for us. So I found 2 or 3, for instance, that myself that work for me. I'm happy to share them if that's useful. And also just a few trusted colleagues, 1 or 2 people that I know are really good at finding information and getting their support to kind of help me stay informed.
And then the other angle to this is determine in advance what it is that you want to know. Because there's such a vast array of information out there that you find yourself going down rabbit holes. After a while, you can't even be sure what it is you were looking for in the first place. So there are certain things we all need to be informed on. And then there is another aspect to, information that is more preference-based. So combining that role with what you're saying is, I'm going to go in knowing what are the questions that I need answered, and then looking for a source that is a valid source of information. Because unfortunately, in the time we live in, information, it doesn't, because it's out there, doesn't mean it has a value in an objective, factual sense of the word. So combining those 2 things, I think, will already enhance the search you're embarking on.
I like those ideas. I worry that people who are really anxious are going to overlook for information, right? And then we're back to the beginning, actually, in our first session around overdoing information to try to make yourself feel safer. Another thing I was thinking about that I mentioned a little bit, but maybe to go into a bit more detail around it, is as an academic and as a clinician, I tend towards more harm reduction models as opposed to abstinence models, right? So I like to look at complexity and understand risk from a variety of perspectives and not just black and white, yes and no. And so in this case, for me, this is about understanding risk and really looking again at your whole person approach. So who are you as a whole being, not just your likelihood of getting corona or your physical health, but really looking at yourself and your family and people that you're connected to and deciding what's right for you based on a whole bunch of information that your body, that your emotions, that your cognitions, that your physical health is giving you, and try to, what does risk mean for you? What's best for you right now within the guidelines? And I think there's a lot of space to move with limits, but there's some space to move in there that might suit your needs better than your neighbors, right, Marius? Like having the barbecue might be really important for you, where it may not be okay for the neighbor because they're too fearful, whatever. And so that's, I think at some point we should talk about shame too, and trying really hard not to have judgments and shame about what other people are doing, which is challenging.
I like that link, because I think it's kind of like getting clear about what the risks are for oneself, but then actually looking and saying, okay, what's my risk tolerance? And what's really important to me? And then making some personal choices around that. And I think tying into what you're saying around suspending our judgments, I think part of that is like taking care of ourselves so that we do kind of reduce our own physiological arousal. And we've talked about this in previous sessions, where when we do that, we actually engage our pro-social way of being. So we're much more likely to understand other people's behaviors, and we're much more able to share our own experience from a place of calmness, and set those boundaries and be clear about and defend even our own choices if we've taken some time to really settle ourselves down. And that actually helps our creativity. When we do that, we can get creative about how we might actually honor our needs.
Yeah, I like that.
So again, I want to bring across the point of patience and understanding. We are facing a gray zone, a little bit of a gray zone. We know what the overarching regulations are. We're clear on that, but there is some room for making your own informed decisions. So I am going to remind myself all the time to be very patient, to try and understand someone else's scenario when I find that it's in a bit of a conflict with my personal conviction or how I believe we should be approaching this. And really just keep that in mind. We are still in a very uncertain time. There is still a lot of anxiety present. This reintegration phase that we're talking about now almost feels like it will require more patience than when we were right there in the beginning of the chaos, because this is just a different challenge, but it's one that we will overcome. We know that for sure. But overcoming that with grace and patience is really what it's about for me.
I think that's really well said. It strikes me that, it's an old saying, of course, but we don't know what's going on for people. I think sometimes this conversation actually is very privileged. And there's a lot of people in our society, in our communities, in our province who don't have the privilege to make really nuanced decisions. Poverty, abusive situations. And so sometimes people's choices are due to those structural and contextual factors that we don't have any idea about. And so to have that patience and non-judgmental approach, even though it might really cause you anxiety and fear to see people not social distancing enough in your mind. I think there's a whole lot that goes into that really challenges us. It makes us hard, and yet here we are. Let's do it. Raul, would you like to help us with our own nervous systems? Seems to become a highlight of this Med Talk, is you leading us through a mindfulness exercise.
Sure, I'm happy to explore that once again if we're ready for that.
Feel like a good time? Yeah.
Sure. So I think maybe for this practice, we'll combine two things, where we'll do a mindful practice to settle our systems, and then also reflection, so that we can, in a sense, start to tune into our own unique needs, our own unique wants, what matters to us most. You mentioned before, Lisa, that yes, I'm living with my parents. And so for me, it's a really important reflection. What matters most to me and what matters most to those that I'm caring for or that are caring for me. Never quite sure which way that relationship's going. But that can really help me decide, as Marius, you were saying, what information do I need to find out about that? And it helps me actually limit the choices I'm having to make. So I'm going to invite all of us. We'll do, I think we've explored before, the stop technique. And so the S is to stop. And that's, again, just an invitation to let the train of your mind that's often going back into the past or into the future, planning the day, or rehashing past events. We're going to just see what it's like to get off either of those trains and see if we can just be here and realize for the next 10 minutes or so, hopefully there's nothing else you have to do other than just to be. And if that's the case, then you might invite the T, which is take a breath. And that's an invitation to take a deeper breath. For me, that often means breathing down into my belly, or maybe into my sides and the back, as a way to just tell my body that right now I can afford to take off some of the armor that we might feel like we have to wear. And as you're taking some breaths, you might notice places in your body where you might just let yourself soften. Maybe in the shoulders or the jaw. And then the O is to start to open our senses to observe. And it's often helpful to just start taking in our external environment. So really letting yourself register what's around you, either in the form of sounds or smells or sights. And especially being attuned to anything that might bring a smile to your face. I'm noticing the breeze in the trees, a cup of coffee that was only half drunk, but was there waiting for me earlier. So whatever you notice. And then if you're ready, letting that awareness start to infuse your body. So you can maybe just get a sense of where your body's making contact with the ground or the chair or the pet that's in your lap. Seeing if you can be aware of just how your body is right now. Space for what is easy and maybe what's less easy. Bringing some of this quality that we've been talking about of even suspending our judgments of our body. Maybe feeling our breath and noticing how it is now. And our breath can also link us to any emotions. So we could sense just from this conversation what's with us now, whether it's excitement, appreciation, anxiety, frustration, maybe guilt for feeling excited. Who knows? We're complex beings, and so any and all of these emotions might be visiting us. And right now we're just seeing if we can take stock. Part of making decisions, really tune into our emotions, because our emotions actually give us valuable information about what's needed. And so perhaps as the last part of the exercise, we can start to tune into our mind. Notice where our mind is right now, even what is the state of our mind. And letting our mind be however it is. So if it's foggy, maybe a little drowsy, tired, calm, open, curious, whatever you're noticing, letting that be. And because we're exploring our mind, maybe just asking ourselves one or two questions. So, what matters to me most right now? In this phase of our lives, what feels most important for me to honor? we've shared some of the things for us. So whether that's rest or connecting, insulating, making money, whatever it might be, what matters to me most, and what matters to those that I'm caring for. And just seeing if we can make contact with, right now, our most important priorities. So this is all part of the O of stop, and the P is now to proceed into this moment. And hopefully each of us have had a chance to connect with some deeper wisdom, which just comes from tuning in, and seeing if you might, for yourself, just see what proceeding with compassion for yourself, for those that you care about, how might you honor what you've discovered? So for instance, for me, it's, around making sure I rest. And that means like carving out some time over the coming weeks where I have some boundaries around my commitments. And the other priority that came to my mind was around, my parents live in Winnipeg normally, so it's actually supporting them to find a way to get back home sometime. And so it's going to be working with them to find a way to really honor their wish to be home in a safe way that is going to take some risk, but risk that for us will be important. So we'll stop there and maybe just Marius and Lisa, see if either of you have anything you'd like to reflect on before we open it up to any questions.
One of the things you've mentioned.
Go for it.
One of the things you've mentioned was an emotion that I didn't think about yet, but I could associate with that, and that is the emotion of experiencing some guilt for feeling excited, feeling that sense of optimism while knowing that we have so much that we need to be responsible about. But that was a unique emotion that didn't quite cross my mind until you said it in so many words.
I don't know if you guys saw my reaction. I think, Marius, you had your eyes closed, but I opened mine when you said guilt for excitement. And I went, no, I don't have any guilt for excitement. I think excitement is really important to feel and to allow ourselves to feel without dampening it. And yet guilt helps us be socially responsible. And so it's not a bad thing. As long as it's not shame, it's guilt. But I was like, no, I want to be excited. I love the what matters question. I think it really helps us sit with values and priorities and emotions. I don't think it's an easy question for 3 words. I think it's difficult and may change and shift over time depending on what's going on for us. I find it a valuable exercise with myself, with friends, with clients, but not easy.
As you're saying that, it's entirely possible that some of the listeners may not to what matters most. So it may be an ongoing question that might take days. It might take some conversations. It might take dedicated reflection time. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it can be messy, and we may not know until we actually dishonor them. Until we dishonor what matters most, and then we actually go, wow, that was really important to me. So it can show up in so many different ways.
Yeah. Sometimes those values are in conflict.
And sometimes they're in conflict.
Yeah.
I think you've touched on a really interesting approach that people might look at taking, and that is stop thinking about what's the decision of this situation, but think in bigger picture. What, again, Raul, as you said, what matters to me, which will help inform those individual decision making. People have so many questions right now, questions on what to behave, how to feel about their decisions. And Jane McDonald, I'd like to invite Jane in. She's the executive director of the foundation, of course, and is managing the question flow. So Jane, let's hear what people are wondering about.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for adding a bunch of great questions to this conversation. So we've got a few to get through. Number one, as a parent and a grandparent, I'm concerned that over-anxious behavior, as seen through parenting and paranoia, is starting to be more a mental threat to my son and daughter-in-law than the actual threat of COVID here in Sechelt. I also think my grandson needs more interaction with other kids. How do you balance mental health with physical health, and what advice can I give them?
So balancing mental health with physical health. Well, let me start off by saying that's a very nice question. It captures so many aspects of what we're facing. So I'm gonna get right into it and probably not answer all of it, but these are my thoughts in any case. So I'm in agreement that anxious parenting will have a direct and significant impact on your children, right? As parents and as adults, we have the filters and the capacity to reduce a certain load of anxiety and break it down into little bits that can be comprehended by a child or that can be understood by a child. So we cannot just be out there and show all of our anxieties to the kids that do not have the capacity to understand and to tolerate that. So we need to show them some calmness during time of adversity and anxiety. So that's point number one. Point number two is we have been very fortunate and in Sechelt and on the Sunshine Coast and in BC for that matter and in Canada, we have the community to thank for that. Every single person in this community has been pretty amazing. Now, balancing that with the kids' physical need for interaction is important because kids do need that. They are such social beings. And there are ways to connect and to be with other children while still observing public health guidelines. And I think that sounds like the same answer time and time again, but it truly is that. It's about how much am I going to allow myself to be and to enjoy while knowing that I'm adhering to guidelines. Because if we adhere to guidelines, we do not have to have overt concerns about, am I going to impact anyone else adversely? Because these are the best evidence-based guidelines. So it's allowing your kids as much connecting as you possibly can while upholding those regulations. And as adults, we need to filter the amount of anxiety that our kids see. They need to know the reality of what is happening based on your kids' developmental level and emotional, intellectual understanding. But it's up to us to really make it so that our kids can understand and not live in fear.
Pretty comprehensive answer. Don't think much is needed. I actually think the way the question is worded, the person writing it already knows the answer. Yeah.
Okay, moving on.
Well, actually, sorry, Jane, before you go on, I say one other piece just around some of the evidence, because I think we are starting to see some emerging evidence that children are less likely to get COVID-19, or less likely to be vectors in the sense, and so it's slightly different parameters for kids, especially when they're younger, and so I think we have to again come back to that question of seeing if we can get informed about changing guidelines that might help us relax a little bit around some of the risk for children, because I think it's actually different than for adults. And then the second part, just to reiterate what Mary said, I like to think of children's nervous system as sponges. Mm-hmm. And so they're actually, the biggest thing we can do to support a child's nervous system is to support our own. And so that comes back to what Marius is saying is, wow, if you can really just let yourself get informed enough to know, wow, we've actually done a great job. Things are actually relatively safe now. And as long as we keep a certain awareness and adaptivity and an informed kind of lens, there's very good reason that we're going to do well as a community.
Yeah, harm reduction, not black and white.
Yeah. Okay. Still shadowed by stigma and shame. What questions can we lovingly ask ourselves and or loved ones to determine if we need to get more help? Is there a pathfinder to help us overcome real or perceived barriers to actually getting help?
Oh, I'm passionate about this question, so I'm just gonna jump the line here and reflect on this a little bit more. There is stigma regarding mental health, and one of the things I'm so encouraged by is seeing the tremendous move away from that. I am so encouraged by what we're seeing here in Canada, how much more inclusive we are, how much more light we've been shining on mental health issues. So the most fundamental question that you can ask someone is straightforward: how are you doing? While you are aware of someone's baseline, that to me is valuable. Sometimes in clinical practice, I'm less interested in how you are on any given day than whether you're fluctuating from your baseline. Now, you know your loved ones, you know what their baseline is like. If you see a tremendous shift from baseline, whether up or down, and it's not only a fluctuation that's lasting a day or two, and it's a pervasive state, then those open, honest questions are perfectly fine. We all have all the complexities and the beauty of mental health. We have suffering, we have joy, we can be struggling, we can be elated. It exists in every single one of us. So to think for 1 second that any one of us may be excluded from that discussion is artificial and inaccurate. Each of us have a whole set of emotions, and it's about acknowledging that and talking about it like we are now. I'm extremely passionate about talking about mental health because it's who we are.
I'm on this panel to reduce the stigma of mental health. And so the fact that the Sechelt Hospital Foundation has asked us to do this, to talk about mental health for the community, it's everything. We just need to normalize these conversations and talk about emotion and talk about things that happen to us as human beings and talk about our nervous systems and how we're impacted by things that happen to us and just normalize that. And for me, especially normalize emotion. I see a lot of people who come into my office who really stigmatize, shame their own emotional states. And that is not helpful. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, shame really dampens our capacity, our innate capacity to heal. And so the more we can do to reduce stigma, reduce shame, and improve acceptance, so essential, really, to have a healthy communities and society. Yeah, on the same page about that.
I'm on the same page too. I'm super thrilled that we're even having this conversation, and all the support around it is really appreciated. Maybe just the one other piece I'll add is one of the ways that I found it's less of a question for a person, but more of a transparency. So what I found is actually, like Lisa was saying, is to basically acknowledge the ways that I may be having a challenge. So if I see somebody else is maybe challenged and they're not saying something, I could just be honest and say, wow, I'm having a hard time. This is what's going on for me. How about you? And just normalizing in that same way, we can normalize with those that we love that these are difficult times and we can't necessarily know how we're going to wake up the next morning right now. And I think the degree to which we can actually share that vulnerability, we make it easier for others to do that too.
Well said.
A little further on the same theme. Isolation, desperation, and thoughts of suicide existed long before COVID struck our community. How is the local mental health team extending its services and community outreach to help those who may not be asking for help or even retreating further?
Good question. I worry about folks who don't have access, who are already vulnerable, and worry doesn't capture it. I think if we look at some of the statistics that are coming out, that 50% have said their mental health has deteriorated more in this period of time. The stats are a little bit all over the place, but more suffering. I certainly worry about folks who are already disenfranchised and not connected to good care. Yeah.
One of the other aspects is really engaging in a different form of care. I don't know of a single practitioner or clinician on the coast that's not extending their services into virtual health at the moment. So not having that categorical understanding of, because I cannot go into the office, therefore I cannot reach someone. And I mean, I'm just talking about this avenue of help is seeing someone. But reaching out to the offices that you know, connecting with the same treating teams that you know virtually is essential and should continue. We are now working on different guidelines and regulations on how to start in-person care again. And that will be out there soon, I hope. And then it's about exploring that again. So the resources around you should still be the same. It might be delivered a little bit differently, but be well informed on what it looks like.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that's where the peer support is a really important part of this. So if we see people that are struggling, that are maybe less apt to pick up the phone or to reach out, I think that's where we might need to be an advocate for those others as best we can. And I always want to just come back as a primary care provider myself, the role of family physicians. Connecting with your physician, and all the physicians on the Sunshine Coast are equipped and ready to offer virtual care right now, and they can support you with a variety of different resources that are available. So I just want to encourage people to reach out, especially if you feel like, oh, they're busy managing other issues. Again, we're coming back to mental health is really important. It's a huge part of our health. And so your physician does want to hear about it.
I think the question really, again, it's almost answering the question, or there's no answer to this question, but it's really shining a spotlight on the issues. Yes, isolation. Yes, increased anxiety. But particularly isolation is really harming people. That we are, I think, going to see a longer term mental health impact in some folks, particularly those who have more challenges through this process. Yeah.
I want to reinforce, Raul, also what you mentioned now is the peer support model is extremely important. We need to come alongside each other. We need to know each other. We need to be aware. And sometimes if you find that situation where someone cannot reach out for themselves, supporting them, maybe reaching out on their behalf, these things sometimes are indicated.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from someone who is experiencing bubble trouble. How to survive the scrutiny and harsh judgments of others who feel entitled to comment or critique on my choices to socialize in what I perceive to be safe circles. Are there some standards for trust parameters that we can all ascribe to or strive for? Any suggestions on bubble trouble?
That's great.
I love that bubble trouble.
Bubble trouble.
It is the essential difficulty with extending your bubble is everyone you extend your bubble to, in their own sense, is extending their bubble, and it becomes a whole network of connecting. So is there a way to do that perfectly right? No, I don't think so. Is there a way to eliminate risk altogether? No, I don't think so. Is there a way to go about it responsibly and thoughtfully without being absolutely black and white about it? Yes, I think there is. And in as much as we ought not to judge, if we are the unfortunate recipients of others' judgment, then we need to just be as gracious about it as we possibly can, continuously reminding ourselves that the fear response is ever present.
Yeah, and to boundary yourself from shame, right? If you are comfortable with what you're doing and it sounds like this is a really healthy thing to do, and we've been, we need to increase our bubbles and reach out and have some connection. If people are shaming you for that, that's about them, not you. And so really my hands always do this, want to buffer you from that and not take that shame on yourself. That's about them.
Yeah, I love that image. That's a really important part of it. I sometimes get that kind of image from the Matrix movie where he's dodging these bullets coming at him. And so that slow motion movement of our body, I think finding ways to protect ourselves from that. And again, it comes back to making sure we're informed about our choices, and then once we're comfortable, not accepting other people's bullets, if I can put it that way. And so we might have to actually create a boundary, and we can do that if we're taking care of ourselves. We can do that in a kind way. So we might even just say, "Wow, I notice the tone of your voice has gotten really loud, and I'm wondering if you're actually feeling some fear. I'd be curious about what you're going through, but I know I'm making these decisions for myself from a place of reflection and wisdom, and I'd like us to have a more mature conversation about this."
Lovely.
I think that'd be absolutely fine to say to somebody.
I'm having an image of that, the bubble trouble, but the bubble is also, the boundary around their own decision. And so to not take that on. Yeah.
The double bubble.
Double bubble. Yep. Nice. A bubble that has multiple.
Another one on reintegration. Financial uncertainty fuels real worry. As our small community navigates reintegration, what does that look like in regards to out-of-town visitors in the upcoming tourist season? In your opinion, how will this affect business that usually thrive in these upcoming months? And how will those businesses then affect the families that are attached to them?
So I know without a doubt that this community will stand together as one and support local businesses. I just know that for sure. Everyone is extremely well informed on the nature of the financial implication that COVID-19 has brought about on businesses and individuals. And I'm almost comforted in knowing that this will be that way. For many people, the federal supports and provincial supports will be in place. But I know, as far as this community is concerned, as much as it is within our strength, we will be supporting local businesses because we know that it's the heart and soul of our community. We know how much these businesses support our cause and support what we're doing and invest in our local community. And that will be reciprocated, and it will be done with enthusiasm. I have no doubt about that. That doesn't quite answer the question. That's just me reflecting on how I see things going forward.
Well, and along with, I think you're absolutely right. Every week that goes by, I more deeply trust our public health decisions, and I feel like we're getting wonderful guidance on at what speed we want to relax things and exactly how. Again, it's not black and white, but within parameters that I think are so far worth trusting. And I think that if there needs to be adaptations that come our way, we're going to hear about them. So far, I feel like that trust has been well earned. And until there's a reason to not believe it, I'm going to continue to let that be what guides my choices and how I support others that are doing the same.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I have too much to add. I just want to really acknowledge financial stress and strain and worry. And I certainly want to encourage people to really sink into our own community, as Maria said, and support local. Couldn't wait to go buy cupcakes last weekend for my kids. We can make cupcakes on our own. That totally wasn't the point. It was a treat, and it was supporting local business, and it felt really good to do.
From the frontline service team here, how to diffuse raw emotions and unwarranted anger when serving on the front line. We're seeing a lot of pent-up frustration and then also sheer exhaustion when it gets twisted into resentment towards those of us in direct service roles. Any suggestions or coping techniques?
That's so hard.
Raul, your mindfulness approach really comes to mind. The one that you practice so often. And I know that you have groups running, promoting mindfulness, because how I want to connect that is when you put together the combination of being burned out and being fatigued, yet being on the front line facing the highest possible risk scenarios, combining that with what you perceive to be irresponsibility by some or by other people in terms of decision making. That's just a volatile combination. That really is a tough emotion to manage. And it's almost like I don't even want to, talk about something that I don't experience personally, but from an intellectual point of view, when you are facing such heightened sense of stress with such a volatile combination of emotions, breathing, pausing, slowing down, being aware of what you're feeling and thinking becomes extremely important. You don't have the luxury of time. You don't have the luxury of sitting down, relaxing a little bit. You have the few seconds to breathe and to think about what is happening and to choose your next response. And for those in the front line facing these emotions, it is extremely important that you talk about it, that you share your experiences after and before, and that you acknowledge exactly what you're going through and what you're feeling. And therefore, the mindfulness approach really is so essential for individuals facing this level of distress.
It's traumatic. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Well, I'm just going to add that, I think one of the things that, and this may not be a totally an answer that a person might want, but what was coming to mind for me is around just that piece that it's easy for us to focus on the negative feedback we get. And so I'm thinking, for instance, of some of the essential workers. You might have 1 or 2 out of 100 people that give you a really hard time. And it's so easy to focus on those 1 or 2 people because they can ruin our day. That's our kind of our bias as human beings, is to focus on those threats. And what I might invite is to take in the 98 other people who might have appreciated your service, who have cared for you, who have come, maybe brought you a cupcake, have maybe given you an extra tip, or have, driven by and honked their horn by your place. So there's so many different ways that people are appreciating the essential workers. And so I would invite you to linger in some of that and kind of let yourself really acknowledge that and not let the 1 or 2% of the experiences take over the rest of your experience.
Well said. I in private practice, I see a lot of frontline people, and these can be really difficult, stressful, almost traumatic experiences when they get abused, right? People saying really awful things to them and exhibiting their own fear and anxiety out onto frontline people. And most of my experiences that are frontline people, when they're well, know that that's not about them, and they can really, there's my hand again, really buffer that and not take that on, and not. But over time, I think it really speaks to knowing yourself and knowing when you might be absolutely exhausted and need more nourishment, need more time, need more space, need more self-care, and to really focus on your own mental health. The job you're doing is very difficult and sometimes injurious and traumatic and stressful. And so sometimes we need to pause and really take care of ourselves.
If I could just add to what you're saying, Lisa, because I think it's so bang on. Another way we can take is, again, peer support. So yes. I highly encourage people that are getting into these situations is to process these experiences with people that you trust. And that's a huge way to support our own system to release some of this and not hold on to it and accumulate some of those injuries.
And we shift stigma as we do that, right?
Right.
We create mental health, normalize mental health issues in high functioning frontline people who actually sometimes have the highest rates of stigma because they're the helpers, they don't receive. And so not only do you get to process your own nervous system, hopefully in a safe environment, but we shift culture as well and promote wellness.
Believe it or not, that is an hour that has flown by. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Marius. Thank you, Raul. That's wonderful as always. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in today and those of you who will watch this later on the recording. Thank you for your ongoing support of frontline workers, healthcare workers, the contributions you make to the foundation, and just being there for each other. We certainly appreciate it. We want to keep this conversation going, as all of you have talked about today, normalizing discussions around mental health issues. We want to keep practice going into the future. However, we are going to take a 2-week break, and then we'll look at navigating reintegration part 2, because by then we'll have had 2 weeks of doing it, and we'll see how we'll check in on that. And then we're going to take some time off in the summer and come back. So please get in touch with us. Let us know what other issues you'd like to talk about. Let us know where you want to take this conversation, because it truly is a conversation with the community. So we appreciate very much having you here. Once again, thank you to our sponsor, the Sunshine Coast Credit Union. Thank you to Vasari Media Group for technical support. Thank you, all of you, for being here. We will see you on the 9th of June, and check in to see how you're doing with this brave new world. Thanks so much. Stay connected. Stay well. Bye for now.